You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. Welcome to my program. This is Scotty Roberts, and you're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And go over to odysy1.com to see all that is Odyssey Radio. Check out all the different networks where you can pick up this show, as well as terrestrial stations where it airs. Or you can come over to my YouTube channel at Mr. Scotty Roberts to see the video simulcast of this program and join the chat room, the live chat room, where you can hook up with other, well, not literally, where you can, join up in the chat with other people that watch the show. There's a great family of people over there. I think you'll really enjoy it. You can contribute to the conversation or just come on in and be a bystander and watch. So over on my YouTube channel, again, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And I want to thank you for being here today. It's Friday. It's a good day of the week. I woke up today and I was very up, and I've had an up day all day. So far, knock on wood. And so I like Fridays. The only problem with working for yourself on a Friday is that my office is always here. So when I go home for the weekend at the end of my day, I'm still here at my office as well, and my studio. So I hope you're going to enjoy the weekend. I hope you have some good plans. And I hope you enjoy this show as a nice late evening kickoff for your weekend. And again, thank you very much for all of you being here. On Sunday morning, let me make this announcement. I will be here with, not on the live radio broadcast, but on my live stream here on my YouTube channel with It's Sunday, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, 10 a.m. out east, or 7 a.m. Sorry, it's so early for you California-ites out there, but on the left coast, it's going to be a little early. But join me for live. It's Sunday, and that's with my live stream. And we do tarot readings, we discuss current events, and I'm able to actually interact with you live right there in the chat. So thank you again for being here. Come on in on Sunday morning if you've never been there. And also, if you'd like a tarot reading, just come on over to my website, scottallenroberts.com, and click on the tarot link and sign up for one of the 5 or 10 card readings, and we'll get you on the schedule. So that's all I got to say about that. Let's move on into today's program. I don't want to be so heavy-handed because it's Friday, so I thought I would move off of what I've been talking about most of the week, which has been the Inquisition and the barbarity of the early Christian church, which the Roman Catholic Church kind of justifies by saying it was different times and things were understood differently back then, and the church was trying to cleanse heretics out of the church and so on and so forth. But at the same time, remember that they incorporated torture and brutality to subdue those who did not think like the church. So I'm sorry, in my book, there's no justification for what the church did, as much as they try today. The best they can do is say, hopefully we have evolved and we don't do those kinds of things anymore. The only historical context you can say is that took place in the past. The church needs to own it, move on from it. And so that's the Orthodox Christian Church, the literalist Christian Church, which is now today represented by the Roman Catholic Church and all of its different offshoots, even into Protestantism. So I thought I would leave off for that for a little bit. And there's some questions that have arisen, and sometimes it's just a phrase people will throw out, things like, oh, Jesus didn't exist anyway. So I thought, and Rocky taunts me, by the way, all the time, that, yeah, Scotty Roberts Show, it's all about Jesus. Well, it's really not. It's all about, we've been looking at the historical studies of Christianity, paganism, Gnosticism, all of that stuff. But today, I will concede, today I'm going to talk strictly about Jesus. I want to look into this question. Did Jesus really exist? Is he really an historical figure? And I've got all kinds of information up in front of my eyes here on my computer screen that I'm going to be drawing some details from, as well as my own notes, my own commentary. And so I will say this from the onset. No matter what I'm covering here, and I will make commentary along the way, I have never doubted that Jesus was an actual human being, that Jesus, called the Christ, was an actual human being, that a religion was founded on this character by his followers. Where I have questioned Jesus is not in his existence, but who he truly was. And so what I want to do here is I want to start going through a little bit about Jesus. And I may make this just a one-time episode. I don't know that we're going to spill over, although we could talk about this for weeks in all the different theories and all the different history trying to support the historical Jesus. Now, what we do know is that he's the central figure of Christianity. Arguably, the world's largest religion, one of the major three Abrahamic religions, which seem to be the largest religion in the world. Paganism, however, exists in so many different forms that may be giving it a good contest nowadays. But as a teacher in first century Galilee, in Judea, Jesus influenced countless people. Yet there's many questions that still exist today that surround what I would consider to be this very enigmatic person. Where was he really born? Bethlehem or Nazareth? Did he marry? We've talked about that. Was he a married man? Is there any evidence outside of the Bible that proves he actually walked the earth? Now, this Biblical Archaeological Society ebook was written, Who Was Jesus? Exploring the History of Jesus, is available if you go over to Biblical Archaeology Society. You got to buy a membership over there, but you can pull some really good information out of that. And I'm drawing a few things from that book today. And so, questions arise. Did Jesus exist? Let's examine a little bit about the life of Jesus, from where he was born, where he grew up, and whether there's extra biblical evidence for his existence. Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist? That's the big question. When you ask yourself that question, what do you believe? Did he actually exist? I think he did. So, what's the evidence outside the Bible? There are records that give us a glimpse of who this person was and who he would become as the central figure in Christianity. And remember, that didn't develop for decades after his death. So we have to look at this and ask these questions. There's modern movies, there's novels, and they always want to marry off Jesus to one of his most prominent and perhaps scandalous female followers. And we talked about that. When I talk about scandalous, I'm talking about Mary Magdalene and the way the Orthodox literalist church turned her into a prostitute. That's where the scandal comes from. But Jesus' own words suggest he wasn't interested in worldly matters. So I don't know if we'll so much hit on the marriage today, because we've already covered that, unless we spread this into a much wider study that's going to take more than just today. And so let's take a look at a couple of things. The first thing I want to look at is, did Jesus exist? Is there historical evidence beyond the Bible that suggests that he existed? So the man, Christ Jesus, Did Jesus of Nazareth exist as a real human being in history, set in history? Is there a source point to determine whether or not he historically existed? And I know there are movements out there that believe Jesus didn't even exist historically, that he was complete myth. Now, as we covered many times, the Gnostics, mystics, they looked at the life of Jesus as mythical. They did not necessarily look to the man as being untrue or a fable or just an allegory. They saw him as a literal person. But what they ascribed to him was the mythology of what his followers made him to be. Literally, they accepted his mythology. And so I want to look at this. I want to look at how we examine an extra-biblical, textual, and archaeological evidence that's associated with the man who would become the central figure in Christianity. Jesus is depicted in a vibrant 6th century mosaic that you can see at the Basilica of Saint Apollinaire Nouveau in Ravenna, Italy. You can see artwork of him all over Europe and the Eastern world, but most of those things didn't exist for centuries after his death. So, after 2 decades toiling over this particular question myself, I had to come down to look at the fact that there's enormous interest in this topic. There's all sorts of information you can draw on that both say yes and no regarding Jesus, pro and con. And so the sources that we go to, normally discussed, fall into 3 main categories. 1, classical. That's like Greco-Roman. 2, Jewish. And 3, Christian. But when people ask whether it's possible that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed, as John P. Meyer, a commentator, pointed out decades ago, the implication is that the biblical evidence for Jesus is biased because it's encased in a theological text written by committed believers. And what they really want to know is there extra biblical evidence for Jesus' existence? And I think that's what most of us, when we question this, want to know. What exists outside the pages of Scripture? Because, as I've said many times, I believe the Bible is efficacious in its history, in some of the things it presents. But we've got to remember that all that history is wrapped up in theological clothing. And so you have to strip away the theology sometimes to get at the core story, which is stepping outside the box. I don't want to look at Jesus from a standpoint of whether I believe he is the Savior or not, because if you believe that by faith, that will dictate the way you feel about the historical information. The question is, does the historical information stand on its own? Is there information outside the Bible that makes claims that Jesus really existed? So, I'm going to look at this, and we're mostly going to cover classical and Jewish writings almost exclusively to take a look at this, because that's really where the context lies when you step outside the pages of Scripture. And I'm just checking my time here because I have a tendency to run over. So even when I'm doing this for the radio, I can run over. So I got to be very careful. So we're 14 minutes in, folks. That means that we got about 8 or 9 minutes left in this first segment. So let's start tackling this. Now, that's not a lot of time, by the way. If you were taking a class from me and I gave you a syllabus, this would take an entire semester to cover some of this material. So let's look at Tacitus. He's somebody we've mentioned before in all our studies, going into the Gnostic version of Jesus versus the Orthodox literalist version of Jesus. Let's see. So Tacitus, more formally, he was Caius or Gaius or Publius. Cornelius Tacitus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus. He lived from about 55 AD, so roughly born 20-some years after the death of Jesus, and lived to about 118 AD. And he was a Roman senator, he was an orator, he was an ethnographer, and arguably the best of Roman historians. You can look up the works of Tacitus and find very exceptional histories of the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries, early 2nd century. His name is based on the Latin word tacitus, meaning silent, from which we get the English word tacit. I say that, I tacitly believe in something. I kind of quietly believe in something. So interestingly, his compact prose uses silence and implications in a very masterful way. And one argument for the authenticity of the quotation below here that I'm going to read now is that it's written in true Tacitian Latin. But here it goes like this. Tacit confirmation. Roman historian Tacitus's last major work, Annals, mentions a Christus who was executed by Pontius Pilate and from whom the Christians derived their name. Tacitus's brief references corroborate historical details of Jesus' death from the New Testament. And there is a volume that you can pick up, Tacitae Opera. It's all in Latin, so you probably, unless you know your Latin, going to have a tough time reading it. We're going to get into a little explanation of that here. The Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote these things, Tacitus's last major work, titled Annals, was written about 116 to 117. This is like a year before his death. And it includes a biography of Nero, the emperor. In 64 of the Common Era, during a fire in Rome, Nero was suspected of secretly ordering the burning of a part of town where he wanted to carry out a building project. So he tried to shift the blame to the Christians. Now, we've known of things like that happening even nowadays, not from the emperor necessarily, or the leaders of our country, but I know I was at the Minnesota Renaissance Festival for years, and if any of my friends from the festival listen to this show, you'll remember the big fire that took place. There was some unproven accusation that was burned down to get the insurance to rebuild another portion of the festival. So these things happen. They've happened in history all throughout. We all know of stories like this. So this was the occasion for Tacitus to mention Christians, whom he actually personally despised. This is what he wrote. The following excerpt is what Tacitus had to say about Christians. He says, "Neither human effort, nor the emperor's generosity, nor the placating of the gods ended the scandalous belief that the fire had been ordered by Nero. Therefore, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christians." The founder of this name, Christ, or Christus in Latin, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Supposed for a time, the deadly superstition erupted again not only in Judea, the origin of this evil, but also in the city, Rome, where all things horrible and shameful from everywhere come together and become popular. So this is what Tacitus wrote about mentioning Christ. And Tacitus's terse statement about Christus clearly corroborates the New Testament on certain historical details of Jesus' death. Tacitus, one of the most respected 1st to 2nd century Roman historians, presents 4 pieces of accurate knowledge about Jesus. 1. Christus, used by Tacitus to refer to Jesus, was one distinctive way by which some referred to him, even though Tacitus mistakenly took it for a personal name rather than an epithet or a title. He used that name to describe this is who he named as the founder of this religion of Christianity, was the Christus or Christus. And so number 2, this Christus was associated with the beginning of a movement of Christians, whose name origin originated from him. 3, he was executed, says Tacitus, by the Roman governor of Judea. And 4, the time of his death was during Pontius Pilate's governorship, procuratorship of Judea, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, many New Testament scholars date Jesus' death to around 29 in the Common Era, 29 A.D. Pilate governed Judea from 26 A.D. to 36 A.D. for about 10 years there. An interesting note about Pilate, and we've mentioned this before, he subdued 5 different Jewish rebellions in the first few years of his procuratorship. And so Pilate governed right in the years that Tiberius was emperor. And he ended his tenure in Judea about a year before Tiberius Caesar died in 37 A.D. And so Tacitus, like classical authors in general, doesn't reveal his sources that he used. That's the classical era. But this shouldn't detract from our confidence in Tacitus's assertions. Scholars generally disagree about what his sources were and who those sources were. Tacitus was certainly among Rome's best historians, arguably the best of all. At the top of his game as a historian, and he was never given to careless writing in all of his works. So people trusted him, and footnotes and things like that, they didn't exist in context the way they do now. So earlier in his career, when Tacitus was a proconsul of Asia, he likely supervised trials. He questioned people accused of being Christians, and he judged and punished those whom he found guilty, as his friend Pliny the Younger had done when he too was a provincial governor. Thus, Tacitus stood a very good chance of becoming aware of information that he characteristically would have wanted to verify before accepting it as true. Now, the other strong evidence that speaks directly about Jesus as a real person comes from Josephus. Now, I have had my questions about Josephus, and if you remember, I mentioned not long ago in some of our studies that the passage in the histories of Josephus where it appears that he mentions Jesus Christ, that he was tried by Pilate, that he was crucified, and so on, that this was a paragraph that seemed to be inserted into the works of Josephus. And one of the criticisms is that it appears to have been written in a different hand. I'm not talking about physical handwriting, whatever they call that, the study of handwriting. That's not it. It's the hand, the style of writing seemed to be different from the other things. Either Josephus inserted it later himself, or someone else later edited his works and added that in to show a proof for the existence of a historical Jesus. So Josephus was a Jewish priest who grew up as an aristocrat in first century Judea, and he ended up living in Rome. And he was supported by the patronage of 3 successive emperors that supported his work. And in the early days of the first Jewish revolt against Rome, we're talking 66 to 70. This is the time of, if you remember, Masada, and all of that took place then. Josephus was a commander in Galilee, but soon surrendered and became a prisoner of war to the Romans. He then prophesied that his conqueror, the Roman commander Vespasian, would become emperor. And when this actually happened, Vespasian freed him. He says, hey, you were right. He said, I'm going to set you free. And so, quote here, from then on, Josephus lived in Rome under the protection of the Flavians, and there composed his historical and apologetic writings. This was written by Gerd Thiessen and Annetta Mertz. He even took the name of Flavius Josephus, and after the family name of his patron, the Emperor Vespasian, and he set it before his birth name, becoming, in true Roman style, Flavius Josephus. And most Jews viewed him as a despicable traitor to the homeland. And it was by command of Vespasian's son Titus that a Roman army in 70 CE destroyed Jerusalem and burned the temple to the ground, stealing its contents as spoils of war, which are partly portrayed in the imagery of their gloating triumph on the Ark of Titus in Rome. And Titus succeeded his father as emperor. Josephus accepted the son's imperial patronage as he did of Titus's brother and successor Domitian. So, as was with those Roman emperors, many of them didn't live and reign very long. And so Josephus, Flavius Josephus, lived through 3 of them. Now, in his own mind, Josephus remained a Jew through and through, both in his outlook and in his writings that extolled Judaism, and at the same time, by aligning himself with the Roman emperors who were at the time the worst enemies of the Jewish people, he chose to ignore Jewish popular opinion. And we're going to have to pick this up when we come back, folks, because we're right at the end of this segment. Stay tuned for a couple of minutes. We'll be right back.
There's an altar wrought with mystery of Tom the poet and his muse, and a magic lake which gave a light to the words the poet used. Now the muse, she was his happiness, and he rhymed about her grace, and told the stories of treasures deep beneath the blackened waves. Till in the stillness of wonder, still in its misty crown, the muse, she went down to the lake, and in the waves she drowned. And now to see your love set free, you will need the witch's cabin key. Find the lady of the light, gone mad with the night. That's how you reshape destiny. The poet came down to the lake to call out to his dear. When there was no answer, he was overcome with fear. He searched in vain for his treasure lost, and too soon the night would fall, and only his own echo would wail back as his call. And when he swore to bring back his love by stories he'd create, nightmares shifted in their sleep in the darkness of the lake. And now to see your love set free, you will need the witch's cabin key. Find the lady of the light, still raving in the night. That's how you reshape destiny. In the dead of night she came to him with darkness in her eyes. We're in a morning gown, sweet words as her disguise. He took her in without a word, for he saw his grave mistake, and vowed them both to silence deep beneath the lake. Now if it's real or just a dream, one mystery remains, for it is said on moonless nights they may still haunt this place. Set reshape destiny.
All right, folks, thanks for sitting there and waiting through the break. And I appreciate your coming back in. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com. And you can come over and see the simulcast video broadcast of this show over at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on in, join the live chat room, which is already in progress. See the family of people that are there that are Intrep heads that follow this show. And let's jump right back into this. We were talking about Josephus a little because he's the second historian next to Tacitus, who was a very well-known, very respected Roman historian. We had Josephus, who was a Jew, member of a priestly family. Josephus was a commander in the Jewish army, the Judean army fighting against Rome, and he surrendered. He was taken captive. He predicted the emperorship of Vespasian, and Vespasian then elevated him, or freed him and elevated him, and he took on the name Flavius, part of Vespasian's family name, and he succeeded 3 different Caesars as a historian. And so we're looking at him and how Josephus remained a Jew through the whole thing. He was very faithful to what he believed, but he was still a Roman. Now, and he was despised by a lot of Jews. Now, he stood in a very unique position as a Jew who was secure in Roman imperial patronage and protection. He was eager to express pride in his Jewish heritage, and yet personally independent of the Jewish community at large. And in introducing Romans to Judaism, he felt very free to write historical views for Roman consumption that were strongly at variance with the rabbinic views of the day. So in his 2 great works, The Jewish Wars and The Jewish Antiquities, both written in Greek, which was the formal language of commerce during that time of the Roman Empire for educated people, Josephus tried to appeal to aristocrats in the Roman world, presenting Judaism as a religion to be admired for its moral and its philosophical depth. And the Jewish War doesn't mention Jesus except in some versions, in likely later editions by others. This is what I mentioned. But Jewish Antiquities does mention Jesus 2 times. The shorter of these 2 references to Jesus. Now, this is where we're looking at the historical Jesus and did the external to the biblical accounts of Jesus actually exist out there. Well, in Josephus's Antiquities, there are 2 references to Jesus. In Book 20, it's incidental to identifying Jesus' brother, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And in the temporary absence of a Roman governor between Festus's death and the governor Albinus's arrival in 62 in Judea, the high priest Ananus, and you got to be careful with some of these names, Ananus investigated or instigated James' execution, and Josephus described it. And he described it this way: being therefore this kind of person, a heartless Sadducee, Ananus, thinking that he had a favorable opportunity because Festus had died and Albinus was still on his way, called a meeting, literally of the Sanhedrin, of judges, and brought into it the brother of Jesus who is called Messiah. This is how Josephus described James's brother. James, the brother of Jesus who is called Messiah. James by name and some others. Then he made an accusation that they had transgressed the law, and he handed them over to be stoned. So, James is otherwise barely noticed. He's a minor figure in Josephus's lengthy tome of the Antiquities. And the sole reason for referring to James at all was that his death resulted in Ananus losing his position as high priest. James, or Jacob was another name for James, was a common Jewish name at the time, and many men named James are mentioned in Josephus's works. So Josephus needed to specify which one he actually meant, because he thought it was very important to point out that as a direct result of this decision by Ananus, the high priest at the time, kind of interim high priest, this is why he was removed from his office. And so this important event needed to be marked by him making an historical reference. And he needed to specify which James he meant. And the common custom of simply giving the father's name, James, son of Joseph, wouldn't work here, because James's father name was also very common. So James, or Jacob, the son of Joseph, which was Yashaf. So Jacob ben Yashaf would have been a very common name. Therefore, Jesus identified this James by reference to his famous brother, Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua. So Jacob and Joshua. But James's brother Jesus, Yehoshua, also had a very common name. So Josephus mentions, so imagine this, it would be James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Joshua. They were very common names in first century Judea. So Josephus mentions at least 12 other men named Jesus in his works of antiquities. Therefore, Josephus specified which Jesus he was referring to by adding the phrase, who's called Messiah? That guy, that Yeshua, who is called Messiah. Or since he was writing in Greek, the Christos, which is the same as Messiah. And so this phrase was necessary to identify clearly first Jesus, and via Jesus, James, the subject of the discussion. So this extraneous reference to Jesus would have made no sense if Jesus had not been a real person. And this is inserted into the Antiquities. It wasn't even the topic of what Josephus was talking about. It was an aside, so to speak, to identify the person who was also an aside to talk about why Ananus was removed as high priest. So, a few scholars have ever doubted the authenticity of this short account. On the contrary, the huge majority accepts it as genuine. And the phrase intended to specify which Jesus, translated, who is called Christ. So Jesus, who is called Christ, was what he literally said, Josephus, in his writing. This signifies either that he was mentioned earlier in the book, or that readers knew him well enough to grasp the reference to him in identifying James. Now keep in mind when Josephus was writing. He's writing in the late 1st century, so many decades after the death of Jesus. So if he were to use Jesus, the one who is called the Messiah, the Christos, if he's using this as a reference, he's either referring to another mention of him in his own book, or he's referring to something that was already widespread and well known. Jesus, Jesus, the guy that they called the Messiah, that they called the Christ. He's not claiming that he is the Christ or the Messiah. He's just saying this is how he was referred to, and this is the guy, the brother of the guy I'm talking about. There, sets the stage and gives it context. So, the latter is unlikely. First century Romans generally had little or absolutely no idea who Christus was. It was still a very small religion that was starting. It was a small movement. And it's much more likely that Josephus mentioned Jesus or Christus earlier in his Jewish antiquities. Also, the fact that the term Messiah, Christ, isn't defined here suggests that an earlier passage in Jewish antiquities has already mentioned something of its significance. You see how you have to treat some of these older manuscripts? You have to look at how they are written, how they are put together. What was the common usage of language? If we apply 21st century modes of writing and interpreting text to texts written 2,000 years ago, we're going to trip and stumble over things. There was a context and a way they did things back then. So this phrase is also appropriate for a Jewish historian like Josephus, because the reference to Jesus is a non-committal, neutral statement about what some people called Jesus, and not a confession of faith that actually asserts that he was the Christ. He says, whom the people called Jesus, the one that was known as the Messiah. And so the phrase, who is called Jesus, wasn't a question, it was a statement. This Jesus, who is called Christ, is very unlikely to have been added by a Christian for two reasons. First, in the New Testament and in the early church fathers of the first 2 centuries, Christians consistently refer to James as the brother of the Lord, or the brother of the Savior. That's how Christians would have referred to him. The Lord or the Savior, the brother of that guy. And similar terms, not the brother of Jesus, presumably because the name Jesus was very common and didn't necessarily refer to their Lord. So second, Josephus' description in Jewish antiquities of how and when James was executed disagrees with Christian tradition, likewise implying a non-Christian author. So this short identification of James by the title that some people used in order to specify his brother gains credibility as an affirmation of Jesus' existence in history because the passage is not about Jesus. Rather, his name appears in a function phrase that's called for by the sense of the passage. It can only be useful for the identification of James if it's a reference to a real person, namely Jesus, who is called the Christ. Now, by the way, this execution of James, he was dragged out and stoned outside the city gates. And there is a mention that the man Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, this is in the book of Acts, that Saul was one of the leaders of this execution, and that he was the guy that was holding everybody's cloaks for them, made a little pocket change. Hey, for a drachma, I'll hold your cloak for you. And so he was there. He was present at the execution of James prior his conversion to Christianity and changing his name to Paul and claiming apostleship. So this clear reference to Jesus by Josephus is sometimes overlooked in debates about Josephus's other, longer reference to Jesus. Quite a few people are aware of the questions and the doubts regarding the longer mention of Jesus, but often this other clear, simple reference and its strength as evidence for Jesus' existence in reference to his brother James does not receive due attention. So I think knowing that can kind of start to affect the way we view the longer passage, which I have declared, and I've seen others declare, as being perhaps a later edit or a forgery. So the longer passage in Josephus' Jewish Book of Antiquities that refers to Jesus is known as the Testimonium Flavianum. Flavinium. There you go. My Latin. So if it has any value in relation to the question of Jesus' existence, it counts as additional evidence for Jesus' existence. The Testimonium Flavianum, it's Flavian with a U-M at the end. Flavianum. Flavianum. Maybe Flavianum in Latin? The Testimonium Flavianum reads as follows, and it's the parts that are especially suspicious because they sound so Christian. And I'll point out what those are. In Josephus' Antiquities, it says, "Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man." And then I would put in italics, "if indeed one ought to call him a man." Now, that is not just a statement of fact, that's a statement of opinion. And so this is where it is doubted and looked at as, was this an edit later? Because it's making a statement that Jesus probably wasn't really a man, but divine. So around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed he was called, we are to call him a man. For he was one who did surprising deeds, and a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. And then again I would put in italics, he was the Messiah. Period. Now, whether Josephus actually said that or that was added later, we don't know for sure. But it says he won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. Now remember, in the later passage where he's comparing him to James, he says, Jesus, the one called Messiah, the one that people look to as the Messiah, the one that people recognize because he's that guy that was called the Messiah by his followers, is kind of what he was saying there, if you illuminate it a bit more. So when Pilate, go back to the quote here from Josephus, when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him. And one of the portions we think is edited in, for on the third day he appeared to them restored to life. The prophets of God had prophesied this and countless other marvelous things about him. Now, to make a statement like that looks as though it's coming from the standpoint of one who believes in the messiahship of Jesus. Josephus was a Jew. He would not have made a statement quite like that. This is why this entire passage was brought into question. And this is a statement of saying that Jesus rose on the third day. He resurrected. He appeared to his followers just as the prophets foretold. And then the passage wraps up with, and the tribe of Christians so called after him have still to this day not died out. So now, if you were to look at this passage without those little phrases that are thought to be edits added in, it would read like this. Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who did surprising deeds, and a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affections for him, and the tribe of Christians so called after him have still to this day not died out. That's without those other phrases in it. Now, all surviving manuscripts of the Testimonium Flavianum that are in Greek, like the original, contain the same version of this passage with no real significant differences. The main question is, did Flavius Josephus write this entire report about Jesus and his followers, or did a forger or forgers alter it, or possibly insert the whole report? And there's three ways we can look at this to answer this question. Alternative 1, the whole passage is authentic, written by Josephus. Alternative 2, the whole passage is a forgery, inserted into Jewish antiquities. Alternative 3, it's only partially authentic, containing some material from Josephus, but also some later additions by future scribes and editors. So, let's look at these for a second. Regarding alternative 1, that the whole passage is authentic, written as is word for word by Josephus. Today, there's almost no scholar who exists that accepts the authenticity of the entire standard Greek Testimonium Flavianum. I got to get that right. Flavianum. Let's call it Flavianum. Flavianum. The Testimonium Flavianum. So almost no scholar accepts that every word written in that is authentic. In contrast to the obviously Christian statement, he was the Messiah, in the Testimonium, Josephus elsewhere writes as a passionate advocate of Judaism. So this is Josephus expert Stephen Mason said that. Everywhere Josephus praises the excellent constitution of the Jews, codified by Moses, declares its peerless, comprehensive qualities, Josephus rejoices over converts to Judaism. In all this, there is not the slightest hint of any belief in Jesus as the Messiah, as seems to be reflected in the Testimonium. So the bold affirmation of Jesus as Messiah reads as a resounding Christian confession that echoes Peter himself and can't be Josephus. Alternative 1 is clearly out. All the words of Josephus in the Testimonium are authentic. I think that alternative is out. Because Josephus, a devout Jew, who won converts to Judaism, would not be calling Jesus the Messiah. So regarding alternative 2, the whole Testimonium is a forgery. This is very unlikely. What is said and the expressions in Greek that are used to say it, despite a few words that don't seem characteristic of Josephus, generally fit much better with Josephus's writings than with the Christian writings. It's hypothetically possible that a forger could have learned to imitate Josephus's style, or that a reviser adjusted the passage to that style, but such a deep level of attention, based on an extensive, detailed reading of Josephus's works, and such a meticulous adoption of his vocabulary and style, goes far beyond what a forger or reviser would need to do. So even more important in this is that the short passage that mentions Jesus as the Messiah in order to identify James appears in a later section of the book, Book 20, and it implies that Jesus was mentioned previously. That's the implication of it. Jesus, the guy that was called the Messiah, is kind of what Josephus said in that passage. So, the best informed among Romans understood Christus to be nothing more than a man's personal name. They did not know this was a title, on the level of Publius and Marcus. So first century Romans generally had absolutely no idea that calling someone Christus was an exalted reference, implying belief that he was the chosen one, God's anointed. The Testimonium, in Book 18, appropriately found in the section that deals with Pilate's time as governor of Judea, is apparently one of Josephus's characteristic digressions, and this time occasioned by a mention of Pilate. It provides background for Josephus's only other written mention of Jesus in Book 20, when he's relating him as the brother of James. And it connects the name of Jesus with his Christian followers. And the short reference to Jesus in the later book depends on the longer one in the earlier book, Book 18. If the longer one is not genuine, this passage lacks its essential background. So alternative 2 should be rejected. What is it? Alternative 2 again? That it was all a forgery. So alternative 3, that the Testimonium Flavinianum, I still can't get it. I'm just going to call it Testimonium, okay? You'll know what I'm talking about. The Testimonium is based on an original report by Josephus that's been modified by others down the road. Probably Christian scribes. Seems most likely by the content of the language being used. After extracting what appear to be Christian additions, the remaining text appears to be pure Josephus. And I read you that text, how it would read without those Christianized passages. So as a Romanized Jew, Josephus would not have presented those belief systems as his own. He wouldn't have said Jesus is the Messiah. He would not have said that. So interestingly, in 3 openly Christian, non-Greek versions of the Testimonium, Analyzed by scholars, variations indicate changes were made by others beside Josephus. And the Latin version says Jesus was believed to be the Messiah. The Syriac version is best translated, he was thought to be the Messiah. And the Arabic version with open coyness suggests he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So alternative 3 has the support of the overwhelming majority of scholars. And so we can learn quite a bit about Jesus from Tacitus and Josephus. They were two famous historians who were non-Christian. Almost all of the following statements about Jesus, which are asserted in the New Testament, are corroborated or confirmed by the relevant passages in Tacitus and Josephus. These independent historical sources, one a non-Christian Roman and the other Jewish, confirm what we're told in the Gospels. And let's see, I've got really about 3 minutes left, so let's just hit these quickly. They all confirmed, a Jewish historian and a Roman historian, confirmed that 1, Jesus existed as a man. The historian Josephus grew up in a priestly family in first century Palestine, and he wrote mere decades after the death of Jesus. Jesus' known associates, such as Jesus' brother James, were his contemporaries, and the historical and the cultural context was second nature to Josephus. If any Jewish writer were ever in a position to know about the non-existence of Jesus, it would most likely have been Josephus. His implicit affirmation of the existence of Jesus has been, and still is, the most significant obstacle for those who argue that the entire biblical evidence is not probative on this point. Tacitus was careful enough not to report real executions of non-existent people. Another reason, his personal name was Jesus, as Jesus informs us. Josephus informed us. 3, he was called Christos in Greek, which is a translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, both which meant anointed or the anointed one, as Josephus states and Tacitus implies, unaware by reporting, as Romans thought, that his name was Christos. 4, he had a brother named James or Jacob, as Josephus reports. 5, he won over both Jews and Greeks. This is Gentiles of the Hellenistic culture. According to Josephus, although it's anachronistic to say that they were many at the end of his life, large growth in the number of Jesus' actual followers came only after his death. 6, Jewish leaders of the day expressed unfavorable opinions about him, at least according to some versions of the Testimonium. 7, Pilate rendered the decision that he should be executed, according to Josephus. 8, his execution was specifically by crucifixion, according to Josephus. 9, he was executed during Pontius Pilate's governorship over Judea, as Josephus implies and Tacitus states empirically, adding that it was during the reign of Tiberius. So, we're at the end of our time, but maybe we'll pick this up on Monday. But there you go. There are some proofs out of antiquity that proves that Jesus existed historically. Doesn't say anything about whether or not he was actually the Messiah, the Lord, the Savior, but that the man existed. We'll pick this up another time, probably Monday. Have a good weekend. Thanks for being here.